welcome to this presentation. Today, Lisette Calburnell and me, Ana Maria Borges, are going to present you an analysis of the book To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. We've chosen some concepts, some elements that we really think are important to analyze this book and to take into account to read it and to enjoy it. Well, our thesis is To the Lighthouse depicts the literary movement of the epoch, the modernism and feminism. We're going to present you some elements of the modernism as literary movement, and we're going to make a little debate about feminism and how Virginia Woolf represented women's role in society through this book. But first, we're gonna mention some important facts of this book. To begin, I gotta say that throughout her work, Virginia Woolf tried to celebrate and analyze all the Bloomsbury values. Bloomsbury, you're going to be told later, but Bloomsbury was a group of writers, thinkers, and painters that talk about aestheticism, feminism, and independence. So they tried to break all the Victorians' ideas and values. So throughout her work, Virginia Woolf tried to do the same thing, like to break all the old traditions. So this book is divided into 3 chapters or parts, and the first one is the window, the second one, time passes, and the last one, To the Lighthouse. It's important that, well, we found really curious that this book, if you read it, it's like a cycle, because at the beginning, the first chapter, a character wanted to go to the lighthouse, but it's only at the end that this character goes there. So it's like a cycle, and something really interesting that we talked about was that the first chapter was the window, and Virginia Woolf tried to commit suicide, throwing herself through a window, but she couldn't. So, is there any coincidence? Well, we could talk about it later. This book was written in 1927, and most of it is experimentation. Virginia Woolf tried to experiment about new writing styles, so that's why she came up with Stream of Consciousness. This book is also the 5th novel of the author, and most of it's drama, but if you read it, you're going to find out that it's more than that. It's about human beings in general. Okay, this book was the first time published by the Howard Press, and this press was established by Virginia Woolf and his husband Leonard. So it is told that this book is one of her most successful and accessible experiments and important books because of the stream of consciousness style and also because of the topics. As I had said, this book, when Queen Victoria died in 1901, the King Edward's accession to the throne marked the beginning of a new era. So it was like the end of the Victorian era, and Victorian era to a modern era. So that's why all the Bloomsbury group and Virginia Woolf wanted to break some traditions and to think about freedom, about independence, about feminism. So because it was a new era. Okay, Woolf experimentation has to do with the time in which she lived. It means this change of era. The turn of the century also was marked by scientific developments. For example, Charles Darwin and Freud. I know you know Freud. we're going to talk about that later because it was really important to this book. Well, this book, its characters are based on her own parents and siblings. So this is one of the most autobiographical fictional statements of Virginia Woolf. Also, we could say that this book is, yes, like a cycle, but also like closing a cycle, because Virginia Woolf once in a text that she wrote called A Sketch of the Past, she said that she was obsessed with the idea of her mother. So after completing this book, Virginia Woolf declared that she was no longer obsessed with her mother. So we could say that it's interesting that this closing cycle could be related to Freud's idea that he says that making conscious the unconscious, it's one of the necessary steps to solve it. So through the writing, maybe Virginia Woolf left her obsession with her mother. And well, as I already said, this book was really important because of the stream of consciousness. We're going to talk about that later, but it's really important and famous because of it. And in general, we could say that this book is about human life, also the nature of relationships, and to the experience of times. So we're going to talk about human life, feelings, thoughts, relationships, and also the experience of every character. Now we're going to cover the context. Then with the context, we're going to talk about the Great War and the scientific developments of the epoch. But first of all, there's a quote that I really liked when I read it, and it's a quote by Albert Einstein, who says, "I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." And I really liked it because it made me think about the weapons used during this war, during this conflict. And as we're going to cover later, this war was a war of trenches, a war of scientific and technological advances. But first, of course, we have to talk about a little bit about the causes of this war. Well, there were like two sides. Well, the whole world got divided into two teams, the Central Powers and the Allied Powers. During this conflict, the Central Power was composed by Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, and they fought against the Allied Powers composed by Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Romania, Japan, and the United States. They were the Allied Powers. But, well, by the time the war was over and the Allied Powers claimed victory, more than 16 million people, between soldiers and civilians alike, were dead. This World War I is also known as the Great War, and this war began in 1914 after the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. His murder catapulted or allowed into a war across Europe, and it lasted until 1918. Of course, this conflict began in Europe. It ultimately involved countries as far away as United States and Japan. So, the causes of this war in general, well, of course, the assassination of this character, Franz Ferdinand. He was killed by a Serbian. Serbia was like an enemy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, this was one of the causes, but of course, this war didn't happen because only this. It was also because of imperialism, militarism, and nationalism at that time. So imperialism, all the countries started to create like a creation of empires. like the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and also militarism. They were empires, so they had to protect their territories. So they started to build a large armies and alliances. And the last one is nationalism, that every country, every empire was looking out for their own interests. In general, these were like the causes of the war, but there was something really important, that was the technological and industrial advances. Why this is so important? Because these technological advances helped fight this war, and also because in Europe, all these developments turned out to be like a showcase of new technology at the time. As you can see on the slide, there are some characters from a really good and amazing and interesting series called Avatar: The Legend of Aang. And well, I bought these characters because it made me, these technological advances made me think about these like bendings that are water, earth, and air. For example, the blue one, the girl who's Katara, the blue one has a power with, she bends the water. So in this war, the submarine was really important because it helped attack, of course, the enemies by using like the sea. And Toph is the green one. She bends the earth, and by the earth, some industrial and technological advances were the tank, the train, the car. And with Aang, he bends the air. The airplanes were really important in this war because in general, they threw up some bombs. So, of course, there were like more technological and industrial developments like guns, chemical warfare, the radio, and the telephone. It is important to mention that, with these guns or with this like warfare in general, people didn't have to get closer. Like enemies were like fighting too far away from each other, so they fired upon each other across long distances, and in some cases without even having to see each other. That's why this war was a war of trenches. And something really important and relating it to the feminism is that during this war, during this World War First that lasted like 4 years, in England, with men away and at war, women filled many positions at home. So this was like an start of feminism. Like following the war, women had a foothold in life outside the home, rights and a voice. And they started to recognize their values. Now we got the last part of the context called the scientific developments. Of course, there were lots of people who tried to change all the Victorians and all the old values and ideas. But of course, the Queen Victoria was dead. Like, take advantage of that and change everything. So they changed like those values. So, for example, Sigmund Freud, Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, and Albert Einstein, they changed the orthodoxy and traditional values. These innovations in ways of scientific thinking had great influence on the styles and concerns of the contemporary artists and writers, like those in the Bloomsbury group. For example, we have here Charles Darwin. Darwin's theories of evolution, he was like a sinner, a really good sinner, because with this theory of evolution he undermined and unquestioned faith in God. That was like, until that point, nearly universal. God was like the most important thing also, and he tried to change it. And something really important is Freud theories, because like with his strategy of dialogue to treat mental illness, like tell me what you're worried about and I'm gonna take notes of that, and then I'm gonna give you some strategies, and then I'm gonna read or I'm gonna tell you the meaning of your dreams. So Freud theories were about like the treatment of mental illness through dialogue. Remember this, dialogue, a constant dialogue. This is so important for stream of consciousness and for Virginia Woolf's style. So one of his ideas about the Oedipus complex, I think it's like that complex explains that a young child feels sexual attraction to the parent of the opposite sex, and he desires to remove the same-sex parent who blocks his, like, the child's fulfillment. So this Oedipus complex was really interesting for Virginia Woolf, and like in the novel To the Lighthouse, you can see that at the beginning, the James is a son of Mr. Ramses. He feels like murderous toward his father for demanding his mother's attention and for thwarting a trip to the lighthouse. So we have a quote from the book. Such were the extremes of emotion that Mr. Ramsay excited in his children's breasts by his near presence, standing, as now, leaning as knife, narrow as the blade of one, grinning sarcastically, not only with the pleasure of disillusioning his son and casting ridicule upon his wife, who was 10,000 times better in every way than he was, James thought, but also with some secret concealed at his own accuracy of judgment. We have a quote from the book. Such were the extremes of emotion that Mr. Ramsay excited in his children's breasts by his near presence, standing, as now, leaning as knife, narrow as the blade of one, grinning sarcastically, not only with the pleasure of disillusioning his son and casting ridicule upon his wife, who was 10,000 times better in every way than he was, James thought, but also with some secret concealed at his own accuracy of judgment. What are the consequences of the war? Okay, there are another quote that I really liked, and it's by Elvira Sastre. In one of her books, she says that a war never ends. And for Virginia Woolf, it was like really true, because in the second chapter of To the Lighthouse, Virginia Woolf depicts like the consequences of the war in the second chapter, Time Passes. But what are these consequences? Okay, first of all, vanishing empires. It meant like a reorganization of the territories. So, for example, Germany, Russia, Austro-Hungary, and Turkey empires start to reorganize and to divide into smaller territories. Also, the recession, unemployment, and Great Depression, famine, and epidemics. And I think, well, one of the consequences that are like more important for me is that we could link this consequence to our like current situation, because the First World War caused the Bolshevik Revolution, the Second World War, the Cold War, also the Holocaust, the development of the atomic war, the Cold War also. So I think that it is important to see like how the history tells us like the development of the events. Like this situation or current situation didn't start like last year. It started like 60 years ago. So the same happened with the Bolshevik Revolution, the Second World War. It was based on the First World War. Something important, and I think that we could relate the consequences of this war to literature, is like all the technological advances, the radio, the telephone, the car, altered the rhythms and expectations of every life, and these effects like resonated through literature life as a bitterness and alienation. So we see this alienation in the book, in the book To the Lighthouse, and also in the second part, Time Passes, because this part of the book, Time Passes, addresses the impact of the war, its massive destruction in terms of all the deaths of the family members, and also the and the desolation of Ramsey lives and home. Mm, post World post Post World One, literature began like breaking all the traditions. So these were meant for literature like the breaking with older traditions. Now we're going to talk about the context of the author. So, Adeline Virginia Stephen, later known as Virginia Woolf, she was born into an artistic family on January 25 in 1882, and she died in 1941. She was descendant of one of the like most important Victorian England's and most prestigious also literary families. That's why she grew up among the most important and influential British intellectuals of her time. That's why she received free rein to explore her father's library. So since the beginning, like since she was like a child, Virginia Woolf was like interested in intellectual stuff. She started to write at an early age in a newspaper called Hyde Park Good News, in which she heckled her older sister Vanessa, a painter, and her younger brother Adrian. Actually, Virginia Woolf used to think that Adrian was like her mother's favorite son because she believed that he was like the most sensitive child, and we could like relate this with like to the book because James was like the child who was like more important. So well, then though she married Leonard Woolf in 1912, she loved him deeply, but she was not like satisfied romantically or sexually. So for years she sustained an intimate relationship with the novelist Vita Sackville West. Another important aspect of Virginia Woolf's life is the mental illness. How many times have people used a pen or a paintbrush because they couldn't pull the trigger? This is a quote from Virginia Woolf, and it would be good to understand why she used to write such as sad things. And we could say that Virginia Woolf's life was like a balance between success and mental instability. When she was 13, her mother died, and this was like the first time Virginia Woolf, suffered her first nervous breakdown. She was like really sad, she was depressed, so she stopped writing like almost for a year. But well, she started to emerge from her depression, for her depression, when her half sister Stella Duckworth died in 1897. She was sad, but not as much as she was like when her mother died. But it was sad anyway. So she was sad, and she started to emerge again. And when her father died, in 1904, she attempted suicide, throwing herself out a window. That's why I told you that it was for us interesting and curious that the first part or chapter of the book is called The Window. Do you think there's a like connection between these two elements? Okay, during Woolf's recovery, Vanessa, remember that Vanessa was like her older sister. Vanessa moved to Stephen, children, Toby, Virginia, Adrian, and herself. They were like the siblings, the sons. They moved to Bloomsbury. That's why there's like the name of the group is Bloomsbury Group, because there was like a section of London. So they were free. They were alone. So they were free like to pursue their intellectual like desires, intellectual and interests, and artistic interests too. In one trip in 1906, 2 years after her father died, Toby, he was her younger brother, died by a fever. So, and Also, Vanessa at the same time, Vanessa, her older sister, got married. So maybe Virginia Woolf understood these two events like a loose. So she reminded afloat, secretly writing reminiscence. It was like a book about her mother. So as you could see, Virginia Woolf's life was like loss, full of loss and death. So late in life, when she got married with Leonard Woolf, she became terrified by the idea that another nervous breakdown was going to happen. So she decided like to. Well, it is important to mention that not only this fear of another nervous neck breakdown, but also all the losses she suffered, and the lack of confidence in her work. Maybe, well, we already know that she changed like the style of literature, but she used to have a really bad like lack of confidence in her works. So she like decided to commit suicide, and well, before she had tried to commit suicide like multiple times, but at the end, well, she didn't die. But when she decided to commit suicide once again, when all these events happened to her, well, she filled her pockets with stones and drowned herself in a river. It was in 1941. And the last element related to Virginia Woolf's life is the Bloomsbury Group. Bloomsbury was a section of London. Remember that they moved there when their parents died. And this was a group that based all the conversations, all the debates, all the activities, they were based on the scientific thinking development. It means that they wanted to break with all those Victorian and old traditions and ideals. So they had like this type of conversations. For example, Leonard Woolf was a member of this group. He was like the husband of Virginia. Also, Lyndon Strachey, E.M. Forster, also T.S. Eliot and Aldous Huxley were associated with this group. In this group, there were writers, artists, philosophers, and they used to talk about and they emphasized nonconformity, aesthetic pleasure, and intellectual freedom in general. And also, they used to talk about art, literature, philosophy, economics, and psychology. That's why it is important. It was important to mention all those scientific developments. Also, this group was interested in the meaning of goodness, truth, and beauty, and they usually questioned conventional thinking. It is important to mention that Virginia and her sister Vanessa rejected the idea of a home where the woman, where the woman, like their mother, was the Victorian angel, like the perfect woman for Victorian era. So Virginia and her sister rejected this idea. So they determined that instead of serving tea and like serving men in general, they would take part in intellectual discussions. That's why them and their brothers and friends started this Bloomsbury group.
Well, to understand better the book, it is necessary to get closer to the literary movement, which is modernism. It took place at the beginning of the 20th century, and this book was written in 1927. For that reason, it belongs to this movement. So, modernism can be defined as a philosophical and cultural movement which questioning institutions and social concepts that were stable at that time, like church, social classes, government, and of course, women's role. So, as we saw, the First World War shocked the society, and for that reason, nobody trusted again in those social concepts. or those things that ruled the society at that time. So, for that reason, this social movement brought new ideas, new perspective in terms of social, economic, religious, and of course, art. Also, it broke the idea of subjectivity, and fragmentation. So there were many ways to conceive the things, and those characteristics can be seen in the book in two ways in terms of content and structure. So in content, because it breaks with established with the past, right, and it questions women's role in society. The book gives an important and real voice to female characters in the book. And on the other hand, the structure is not common, it's very different. As many people know, Virginia Woolf is the forerunner of a stream of consciousness style. So for that reason, the book doesn't have like a linear narrative. And to sum up, nothing happens in terms of events. But in the book, there are many self-reflections, criticism to the established. And for that reason, that book is really interesting and really amazing. Well, so let's have a look at the plot for understanding better the experimental structure that it has. So if we try to fit the structure in a graphic, in a plot, we can see that the book is the story of a boy who wanted to go to the lighthouse, but he couldn't. And 10 years passes and then he went. So between those events, there is always an approach to people's subjectivity, and there is always a constant inquiry for meaning of life. We as readers are always going from one mind to another to understand the self-reflections that every character does in the story. The characters of the story are the Ramsey family, and they are spending their vacations in their vacation house. So let's have a look at the family. Mr. Ramsey and Mrs. Ramsey have 8 children, and they really love them. Mr. Ramsey is an academic and respectable husband, and his wife can be catalogated as the perfect woman and the perfect wife. She's so beautiful, everybody loves her, and she feels so great for that. In the story, Mr. Ramsey represents the idea of what a woman's supposed to be in that time. On the other hand, there are some other characters, like some friends of the family, like Mr. Banks, Mr. Tansey, and Lily. Lily represents an independent woman. She loves painting and she's not married. So in the story we can see how she should suffer all the social pressure because she's not married and she doesn't want to do it. So we can see how the book depicts 2 different kinds of women. Lily doesn't want to be like the others. She would never marry. One could not take her painting very seriously. She was an independent little creature, and Mr. Ramsey liked her for it. So we can see how the other people in the story conceive Lily as a different kind of woman. On the other hand, we have Mrs. Ramsey. She was a submissive, wise, tender mother, and she wanted that everybody felt comfortable and happy. For her own self-satisfaction, was it that she wished so instinctively to help, to give, that people might say of her, "Oh, Mr. Ramsey, dear Mr. Ramsey, Mr. Ramsey, of course," and meet her and send for her and admire her? Was it not secretly this that she wanted? So we can see how the writer explores the idea of women's role. On the other hand, we have the immortality. The text exposes the idea of being eternal by different ways. Uh, it reflects how some parts of our life are ephemeral. For example, a scene of a dinner where all of they are having dinner, and Mr. Ramsey finally feels peace, and she feels that now everything is connected and is connected with something else that is bigger. So she says, there is a coherence in things, a stability. Something, she meant, is immune from change. As shines out, she glanced at the window with its ripple of reflected lights. In the face of the flowing, the fleeting, the spectral, like a ruby of such moments, she thought, the thing is made that endures. So we can see how they are reflecting about life and how she felt that they can be eternal. There are moments of life when we can be eternal and live in community. There is another way that the text explores about immortality, and it is through art. For example, Lily, she is a painter, and when she paints, she understands that her paintings can stay forever.
Now have stream of consciousness, and this term was coined by the psychologist William James. But this is really important for modernism because it was like a change, or like a try to change the old Victorian writing style. For example, in this case and in general in Virginia Woolf's works, this is related to the form, and in this case, to the lighthouse especially, we see that if you read it, all the plot, all the story happens like in the character's mind. Like in general, we could say that the time in this story is like measured by characters, not by the clock. So Virginia Woolf tried to offer her most penetrating explorations because she was exploring when she started to write this way. Exploration, the workings of the human consciousness as it perceives, analyzes, feels, and interacts with the world. So, stream of consciousness in literature reflected the modernist vision. It's like a writing style where a character's thoughts and feelings are transmitted in a continuous and uninterrupted flow. So we notice the story through characters. For example, James Joyce also used this writing style. Virginia Woolf, Marcel Proust, they're like the early pioneers of this form. Virginia Woolf wrote in an essay, Modern Fiction, that she wanted to show how an ordinary mind on an ordinary day. That's why she organizes this story this way, because she's trying to say that everything is focused on human beings and their emotions and their thoughts. So this style allows the subjective mental process of Woolf characters, and it determines the objective content of her narrative. So we understand, we are told about the story, but through characters.
Well, feminism can be a really good approach where we can analyze better the book. So, feminism can be conceived as a social theory or movement with the purpose of advancing the status of female and protecting their legal rights due to the sexual discrimination and inequalities in the man-dominated society. So we are going to analyze the book using four main ideas from the feminism. The first one is the superiority of the man, and the second is the woman's choice. The third, a perfect woman outside and an unhappy inside, and finally the idea of an independent woman. Well, Marriage at that time meant that the husband was superior or was the dominator in the relationship. And that figure is represented in the book with Mr. Ramsey and Mrs. Ramsey. As I said, Mr. Ramsey was that intellectual husband, and Mrs. Ramsey was that submissive wife. So, woman was conceived at that time as someone who was inferior to in the relationship. So there is a scene when Mr. Ramsey is reading and Mrs. Ramsey is reading too. And he looked at her and he says, and he wondered what she was reading and exaggerated her ignorance, her simplicity, for he to think that she was not clever, not book learned at all. He wondered if she understood what she was reading. Probably not, he thought. She was astonishingly beautiful. Her beauty seemed to him if that were possible to increase. So at that time, the masculine discussion was different. They were trained to be intellectual and women to be beautiful. So men liked to think that if a woman couldn't understand things or couldn't be clever as men, they were so much beautiful and they were like more desirable for men. So, as women weren't part of that intellectual area, they were relegated to the house chores, like clean the house, take care of the family, and make everybody happy. So, marriage was the only alternative for women at that time. And that was really important for Mr. Ramsey. For that reason, she was always trying that everybody get married. She was pushing Mr. Banks and Lily to get married, although she didn't want that for her life. And we can see how the oppression of women at that time was perpetrated too by other women, and also how those patriarchal ideas were part of everyone in the society. Well, we are going to explore the idea of a perfect woman outside and an unhappy woman inside. So, as we said, everybody admires Mr. Ramsey because she was what a woman's supposed to be at that time. And Mr. Tansey and Mr. Banks were almost jealous about Mr. Ramsey for having such a good, kind, and perfect wife. And although she felt a really pride about that, a pride for having that attention, she was always looking for something else. She was always wondering about the meaning of her life. And she had that sense of emptiness. So, in one part of the book, we can exemplify that, and it says, but she wanted something more, though she didn't know, couldn't think what it was that she wanted. So, although she had that perfect life, there were some things that she wanted to figure out and that maybe can help her to understand better her life. So maybe the writer here was exploring an idea of the problem that the women at that time were having, and it was that maybe they had a perfect life, a perfect marriage, but they couldn't live their life in a fullness way. They weren't completely happy because they couldn't do the things that they wanted. Well, now let's explore the idea of an independent woman. That role is represented by Lily. Lily is an unmarried woman, and that was very unpopular at that time because that wasn't part of the expectations that people have for women. Another important fact of Lily is that she was a painter. So, being a painter for her was really difficult because there was always pressure, social pressure, And nobody wanted that kind of activities for a woman. That idea of being an artist was explored by Virginia Woolf in her book A Room for One, when she was speaking and exploring the idea of how a woman can be part of that intellectual or artistic area, or being an independent woman, because she doesn't have the economic and social resources for being. So she, of course, woman doesn't have like the time, the money for do the things that a woman wants to do in general. So she was in that book, she was giving like the example about Shakespeare and the hypothetical idea that Shakespeare had a sister. That sister wouldn't have the same opportunities for being an artist and well recognized writer, because let's suppose that that woman would have a very good skill for writing, but at that time she wouldn't have the money and the social support for do the things that Shakespeare did. So that idea of being independent and the things that a woman needs for being independent are evident in the book by the character of Lily. In the book, Mr. Tamsey was always reminding her that a woman can do those kind of things. A woman can paint and a woman can write. And for that reason, that pressure of patriarchy shakes her confidence. And she was always wondering if she was doing the correct thing. So at the end of the book, she was trying to painting Mr. Ramsey, and at the end of the book she recognized that she was doing something that she really enjoys, and also she was trying to remember how Mr. Ramsey was. Her positive aspects and her negative aspects too, and she realized that Mr. Ramsey hadn't Mr. Ramsey didn't receive the recognition that she deserved, because he was really important for her family, and she always wanted that everybody was happy. And when she died, nobody remembered that. So in that last part of the book, we can see like a gesture of empathy that Lily had with Mr. Ramsey. And I can say that maybe she's having like a sense of sisterhood. And she was trying to recognize that different women, because in the book we had those women, those different kinds of women. And she was trying to recognize that difference, but always in order to highlight the good things that Mr. Ramsey had. Well, to conclude, To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf is a really interesting book, and it represents the feminism and modernism. The modernism because it has a really interesting structure and content. The structure is very experimental, is a new idea at that time, and we can see how she was promoting that new writing style that was a stream of consciousness. And by a stream of consciousness, we can see the ideas and the subjectivity very close, because we are like in the mind of that character. On the other hand, in content, the writer was questioning meaningful things about life, like the women's role or the men's role too, the idea of family, and many other things that you can enjoy if you read the book. And on the other hand, feminism is really explores in the book the idea of what a woman is as in a society, and how the book gives us two different kinds of women is really interesting. So we invite you to read the book, to enjoy it as we did, and we hope that this video can give you and help you to analyze the book. So thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.